მოგესალმებით, დღეს გვყავს საინტერესო სტუმარი, რადიო თავისუფლების ევროპის ბიუროს რედაქტორი რიკარდ ჯოზვიაკი, რომელთან ერთადაც ვისაუბრებთ საქართველოს შანსებზე მიიღოს ევროკავშირის წევრი ქვეყნის კანდიდატის სტატუსი. Thank you for joining us for the interview in this very critical moment for Georgia's history. Today we are greeting our guest, Europe editor of Radio Free Europe, Rikard Jozwiak, and today we are going to talk about several issues, but of course it's quite understandable that our main interest is Georgia's aspirations, Georgia's EU aspiration, and our future with the EU. And first question. What do you think? What are the chances of getting the candidate status for our three countries, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine?
I actually think none of the countries will get a clean candidate status. I think the opinions that the European Commission will come with later in June will give some sort of conditional candidate status, potential candidate status, where they basically map out a roadmap for these three countries how to get the candidate status. If there is a country that will get candidate status, that would be Ukraine. They are considered sort of the front runner, and there is large sympathy for the country because of what's going through, especially among the European population, actually, the EU population. But in general, I think that a clear candidate status for any of them is a step too far right now.
And what should Georgia have done to fulfill the EU demands for the countries seeking the candidate status?
This is a two-way street to a certain extent. Georgia especially have to focus on the judiciary. Brussels has been very clear that there are problems with the judiciary in the country. There have to be more economic reforms. There has to be a better political culture in the country. Of course, eventually you need to settle the frozen conflicts as well. You cannot join the European Union with 20% of your territory occupied. But I also think the main problem here is the European Union itself. Let's face it, the European Union is not keen on enlargement. Yes, there are countries that are keen on enlargement, mainly countries in Central Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Poland, and so on. But key countries, France, Netherlands, even I would say Germany, they are not particularly keen on the EU becoming much bigger anytime soon. And I see this from the Western Balkans. I've followed the Western Balkans for nearly 2 decades now, and these countries are parked in a garage for a very long time now. They are not going closer to the European Union in any speed possible. And these countries are still countries that are, economically speaking, and I would say even in certain sense, politically speaking, further ahead than Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. So you are looking, as a Georgian or as a Ukrainian or a Moldova, at a very, very long road ahead of you.
And still, if Ukraine and Moldova get this status and Georgia is left behind, unfortunately, this decision might have the same impact as back in 2008, when Georgia and Ukraine refused NATO membership action plan, because by Russia, for example, it might be interpreted as a sign that the West is leaving Georgia in the sphere of Russian influence. And Georgia is left alone face to face with Russia. So, are there any analysis made or discussions inside the EU about the risks and threats their refusal might cause for Georgia?
Yes, of course there is, and of course everyone understands that after February 24th. The situation changed in Europe as a whole, and they want to give signals to these three countries, but especially Ukraine, with an emphasis on Ukraine, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. This is what this candidate status or potential candidate status is. But at the same time, the tunnel is very long, And the truth is that many countries, especially the western part of the European Union, they are worried about Russia as well and Russia's response. They are afraid of the nuclear buttons that the man in the Kremlin has, if I put it bluntly. So they're worried, and they don't want necessarily to step on Russian toes either. So there is this fear, not only about Russia, but also of, in a sense, by taking these countries in, that you're importing trouble. So the argument goes both ways, in a sense. Yes, we want to give, we as the EU wants to give a signal, but at the same time we also know that there is a potential playing with fire, or playing with the bear, that is Russia in this sense.
So, do you agree that the internal contradictions inside the EU is more visible now than it was 2 or 3 weeks ago? Can we say that the European unity is at risk regarding Ukraine? And if so, how do we explain this? By the effect of the Western fatigue, or by the growing Russian influence?
I think it more has to do with Western fatigue, to be honest with you. I think it has to do, to a large extent, about the wallets of ordinary EU citizens. Because in the beginning there was great sympathy for Ukraine, and there were sanctions, and they were not really hurting EU citizens very much. Yeah? But right now we are looking at a situation where inflation is going through the roof. Gas prices are getting extremely high, energy bills are getting extremely high, food prices is rushing through the roof, and the EU is worried that this will have an impact, politically speaking, in the EU. Maybe not now, but, you know, there's always an election somewhere. And when these sort of prices are going through the roof, it's very easy for populists to say, listen guys, these politicians of ours, they are thinking more about Ukrainians than you. Czechs, Poles, Germans, whatever you want. So the fear is also there that, you know, yes, we're trying to help Ukraine, but we can also, in a sense, shoot ourselves in the foot, and we will have someone like Marine Le Pen in power or something similar, and then it's basically the end of the EU as a whole. And the EU will completely dysfunctional. So there is always this balance between showing solidarity with the heroic efforts of Ukraine and at the same time making sure that your own population is satisfied with you. Because after all, every politician, whether it's Macron or Scholz or Morawiecki, they're not elected by the Ukrainian people. They're elected by their own people, and they look after the well-being of their own people. This is the sad reality.
Yeah. Can we formally divide the Western countries into 2 groups of states, one of which is led by Ukraine, is guided by a moralistic way, then the other is following more pragmatic approach? And if so, whose approach seems more effective in confronting Russia?
It's clear that we have a few hawks, let's say, led by, I would say, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic to a certain extent, but let's say the Baltic states and Poland that are very hawkish. And of course, they are getting under the skin of Russia. This is clear. But in the EU, you cannot really do anything unless everybody is on board. When it comes to the big decision, you need unanimity. And this unity is, of course, strength, but it's also weakness. It's clear, it's 2 sides of the coin. You look at the sanctions that the EU politically adopted today. This oil embargo is great. I mean, who would have thought that you could have an oil embargo against Russia? It's okay, it starts with 60%, then it's hopefully going to go up to 90%, but it's full of holes, it's full of loopholes. Why? Because one country, and it's not even the biggest country, but it's enough that one country blocked it. Funnily enough, I mean, very few people follow this, but there was also in the sanctions package, for example, a proposal to ban Russians to buy real estate in the EU. Cyprus One of the smallest countries in the EU said, no, we don't want that because Russians are buying a lot of stuff from Cyprus and it's an income for us. And what happened? This proposal is gone. And this is little Cyprus, that is like, I don't know, but let's say 1-2% of the population. So that shows, as well that you can have different groupings and stuff like that, but ultimately you have to all agree and it becomes the lowest common denominator. And that means the EU as a foreign policy player will always be too little, too late, not sufficient.
By the way, how do you assess the last package of the sanctions adopted by the EU members yesterday? And what will be its effect or impact on the battlefield?
I don't think there will be any impact on the battlefield. Quite frankly, I think that Russia cares, it hurts them, but they will continue. I mean, Russia, there will be the sixth package now. I haven't seen that any of the packages have had any impact on the battlefield. The only way this can potentially have an impact on Russia is when there's no trade at all with Russia and the economy completely grinds down. But this is the sad reality we live in. The West, as a concept, and I'm talking not only about EU but also the United States, no longer runs the world. We have a multipolar world, and Russia can turn to China, Russia can turn to India, Russia can turn to many other countries to keep its economy up. Of course it will be weaker. Of course they will not develop well. Of course it's always better when you trade with everyone. But Russia has options, and the sad thing I see with all these sanctions is actually how few countries have adopted them. I mean, they're very, yes, you have Britain, you have the United States, you have Australia, Japan, you have the traditional West, but I don't see many other countries doing that, including, in fact, your own country, Georgia. So you see that, India is not adopting any sanctions, China, of course not. So this is the sort of thing that there are a lot of openings for Russia still there. So for Russia to really start losing on the battlefield, the changes will have to come inside Russia. There has to be enough Russians who will feel enough pain to rise against their own government. And I don't see any signs of that.
So, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg worried in Davos that the Western countries must not trade their security for economic profits. How understandable is this challenge for the European countries?
It's a major challenge. I mean, you look at where the growth is, where new investment comes these days. And yes, of course, we are trading, the West is still very strong economically, we're trading with each other, but how can you as a country that is having not a very growing economy say no to investment from China, for example? If they're coming and investing in a new road, new bridges, whatever, and that money can then generate schools, hospitals, whatever, it's attractive. I understand that. I mean, it's sort of like, or when Arab countries, like, the rich Emirates come and want to throw money along as well. This is clear. So, in a sense, the West also have to say, we have to spend more money on each other. We have to loosen our purse strings. We have to simply spend more. But that also means, for example, higher taxes for us. This is the sort of thing, that there's only so much money left for the European or the American middle class to spend. So we need foreign investment as well. This is the sad part of the global economy, that it's global. So I understand perfectly, that we shouldn't take investment from China. We shouldn't take investment from Arabic countries. But at the same time, somehow we need to grow as well. And I perfectly understand why a country like, for example, Czech Republic I'm in right now, it's interesting when the Chinese come and offer billions here and there. Who can say no to this? And I think it's the same in Georgia.
Yeah, but it's clear that there is no economic welfare without security.
Yes, no, of course, absolutely not. And this is the sort of, no one has stopped trading with China, even the American. Look at the surplus they have with China. They're trading like hell with China, billions every day. Of course, they are strong enough to resist still, but the Chinese influence is growing. I think, in a sense, we're talking a lot about Russia now, but Russia is a declining power. And what we see with all these attacks is, in fact, that they are weak. But the Chinese, it's a completely different thing. They are growing, and they are growing a lot. They're watching China, they're watching Russia, and they will pose challenges to us. So that's why in NATO now, yes, they're talking a lot about Ukraine and Russia, but in Madrid, the summit, NATO summit, a lot of the discussion will be about China as well, and how we answer that as a Western concept, you know. So that is, I think, the question of this century, in fact.
The current phase of arms supplies does not enable Ukraine to launch a long-scale offensive. And at the same time, it allows Russia to occupy more territories in Donetsk and Luhansk. And winning back those territories will be quite difficult for Ukraine, and it will require to pay enormous human sacrifices and even more assistance from the West. Why is the supply of weapon delayed despite numerous statements?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I think it's because, to a certain extent, I want to answer this a bit philosophically. I think we in the EU, we have become peace damaged. You've probably heard that someone can be war damaged, that you're driven by the war, that you're in a sense sort of like don't see anything but conflict everywhere. I think the opposite is true as well. I think you can be peace damaged. It means that you refuses to see danger and conflict and think that everything can be negotiated, everything can be talked about, everything can be solved through peaceful, rational means. So I think this war very much in the European Union has woken up us to the fact that we still live in realism. We are not everything can be discussed in Brussels and agreed in Brussels by just sitting and talking to each other. That is the ideal European world, that we, after centuries of fighting each other, we talk to each other. But not everyone in Europe is subscribing to this idea. Realpolitik still exists. You know, we are not the end of history. We are very much the same history as there's always been. There's war, there's conflict, there's suffering, and it's just that we have decided not to see it. You know, and this is the problem of the EU. Why didn't the EU wake up already in 2008 when there was a war in Georgia? Why didn't it wake up in 2014 when there was a war in Ukraine, or for that matter in the 1990s when you had genocide in Yugoslavia? So we chose to look away. We chose to think that, if you talk enough, if you spend enough money, everyone will be as enlightened as we are and realize that you can solve every problem by just sitting in Brussels day and night till we find an agreement. That's how Europe works. That's how the EU works. But that's not how the world works. So when it came to all these weapons and stuff, I think we're still very reluctant to sort of think, are we really allowed to send these weapons? Because they're going to kill people, and we don't want to kill people because we are good people, we are moral people. So there is also this sort of sense that we are somehow, we don't want to, even though we support Ukraine, we don't want to decide because war is not something we do anymore. So I think it's very much this sort of awakening where, yes, we have weapons, we have a little bit of weapons here and there, we can send it, but quite frankly, we're not too keen because we don't want to be dragged into this conflict. And that is the sort of naivety that the EU is waking up from. And that's why you see that countries that have a much more, I would say in this sense, realistic worldview, UK, United States, have been much better in providing weapons assistance. Europe is lagging behind. Europe doesn't do weapons anymore. We do conferences and late night talks.
And as you described, damaged by peace.
Yes, I mean, I am myself Swedish, and I grew up in a country that hasn't seen war in 200 years. Last time Sweden fought a war was in Napoleonic times, 1814. So more than 200 years of peace, which is not normal. If you look at human history, there has always been wars, and when you grow up in such a place, you cannot realize what it means, and not every country is like Sweden, of course, but for Sweden, it has been a very rude awakening of what's happening here now, that a country like Russia is even threatening Sweden. That's something that's inconceivable, and that's why the country is joining NATO, which is something I would never think I would see in my lifetime, that a country that in its DNA always has been neutral is going to join the biggest military alliance in history. It's something it's inconceivable in my mind, and I can still not get it, because I'm also part of this generation of Europeans that thought that war was something grandfathers talked about, no one else.
And my final question is about food crisis. Will the growing threat of food crisis cause more pressure on the Ukrainian government to end the war and start negotiations with Russia?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's a very good card to be played by Russia, because they have not many aces in their card decks, but they have two aces. One is energy and one is food. And these are two things that people need in their daily lives. And you will see now when food prices go off the roof, and people might even start starving in the third world because of this. And by the way, you see African leaders, many of them saying that they're not saying it's because of Russia's war, they're saying it's because of sanctions that we have like this. So they're already using a very sort of Russian, pro-Russian language in a sense, whether they want it or not, that this will create enormous pressure on Zelensky and his government to come up with some sort of ceasefire. And I think any ceasefire will be a loss for Ukraine, because Russia will dictate that ceasefire.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I hope it was useful.
Yeah, really very interesting interview. Thank you, and I hope that we will have more chances to have an interview with you. Good luck.
Okay, anytime. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.